All steps in the authentication process, from logging in to proving identity, must be provided in an accessible format. In this unit, we're looking into success criterion 3.3.9, which explains accessible authentication enhanced. I'll detail the intent of this criterion and what it actually means, explain the impact to the user, the criterion addresses, some ways it could be passed, ways it won't, and follow with the summary of what you need to do to pass. By the end of the unit, you'll have a solid understanding of why it matters, understand the user's impact, and how to pass the criterion. 3.3.9 Accessible Authentication Enhanced is a success criterion supporting people with a cognitive impairment. To pass, ensure. A cognitive function test is not required for a step in the authentication process, unless there is an alternative method which doesn't rely on a cognitive function test, or a mechanism is available to assist the user in completing the cognitive function test, and there's a few key terms which need explaining. A cognitive function test is any technique which relies on the user memorizing, transcribing, correctly spelling, calculating or solving of puzzles. And a mechanism is a process or technique which assists the user. If you're working through the course sequentially, you may be thinking this criteria sounds very similar to success criterion 3.3.8, and it is in fact functionally the same as 3.3.8. Whereas 3.3.8 allowed a user to authenticate with objects or personally uploaded content, 3.3.9 doesn't. It has no such provision and requirements are stricter. Users with cognitive impairments, which include memory, reading, numeracy or processing of images and objects, can find it difficult and in many cases impossible to authenticate if the process requires memorizing words, pattern, gestures or character sequences. Additionally, if the authentication process requires user verification through two-factor authentication or CAPTCHA, then this too can be an added barrier. Asking a user to perform these actions to complete a task is known to be problematic for many with cognitive disabilities. So we know the problem the criterion attempts to solve, but what is the impact to a user? This is Sam. She's had a traumatic brain injury and finds it difficult remembering a sequence of characters or using pattern gestures on her phone. Her phone is unlocked by default, and when logging into government services, has her partner assist by entering the code onto the website for her, which appears on her phone. Sam finds the whole experience frustrating. The criterion intent is authenticating users by avoiding techniques such as solving a puzzle or remembering a password. It's to ensure there is an accessible, easy to use and secure method for users to log in. This means removing any cognitive function technique in the authentication process which relies on the user memorizing, transcribing, correctly spelling, calculations or solving of puzzles, as this places a very high or impossible cognitive burden on people with certain cognitive disabilities. Providing additional support for the user through the authentication process is enough to pass this criterion. This could mean, for example, adding autocomplete attributes on the input fields and relying on a password manager to remember the content, as well as allowing copy and paste to further reduce the cognitive load of a user. Where a user needs to be verified that they're real, it's not necessary to avoid the CAPTCHA, although removing it is always a good thing and will be welcomed by all users. Only that if CAPTCHA or a similar authentication mechanism is used, ensure other forms of authentication not relying on a cognitive function test are also made available. So what exactly does passing this success criterion look like? A user is authenticated via an email sent to their email address, which has a temporary URL. Since the email has a link for the user to click, the user doesn't have to remember or transcribe a code. This passes. Since the website uses username and password text entry with the autocomplete attributes correctly set, the browser or password manager autocompletes the text entry. This passes. A website does not block copying and pasting. Since the user can select their credentials and copy them into the input fields, no transcribing is required. This passes. What does failing this success criterion look like? A website uses two-factor authentication and sends a code to a user device. Since the code is displayed on a device which is separate to the website, the user must remember the code and correctly transcribe it onto the website. This fails. Since the website uses captcha and provides no non-cognitive function alternative, this fails. Any user authentication process relying on memorizing, transcribing, correctly spelling, calculations or solving of puzzles will not pass this criterion, as this places a very high or impossible cognitive burden upon people. Exemptions exist where a cognitive function test is used, but this must be combined with another mechanism to authenticate. Although the recommendation is that these are avoided as they will have a detrimental impact to the user's experience. Asking a user to remember random characters or apply a pattern gesture to complete a task are known to be problematic for many with cognitive disabilities. To pass this criterion, any technique must not solely rely on a cognitive function test. If a cognitive function test is used, it must be combined with another mechanism. The way I recommend to pass this success criterion: ensure copy and paste is allowed in the username and password fields. Username and password fields have the correct autocomplete values. A user is not required to remember any character sequences. And where a cognitive function test is used, an alternative mechanism is provided.